David Carter stood on the sidewalk outside the tallest glass tower in the city and let himself breathe for exactly 3 seconds. The building was called the Aurora Dynamics headquarters, and it caught the morning light in a way that made the entire structure look like something out of a dream or a magazine that someone like him had no business reading. He wore the navy blazer he'd had since his late 20s, the one he'd pressed the night before with a damp cloth because the iron had given out 6 months ago and he hadn't replaced it. His resume was printed on the cleanest paper he owned, 3 copies in a manila folder that Emma had decorated along the edge with tiny star stickers before she'd gone to sleep. He hadn't had the heart to use a different folder. He tucked it a little closer under his arm, looked up at the glass and the steel, and walked through the front door. The lobby was enormous and spotless, in the way that only truly expensive buildings manage, not sterile, but deliberate, as if every surface had been chosen to communicate something about the people who worked there. David checked in at the front desk, received a visitor badge, and was directed to a row of chairs near the elevator bank. Around him, other candidates waited. Most of them were younger, in suits that fit precisely, and held laptops open to technical documents they reviewed with focused expressions. David noticed the laptops. He had a laptop at home, a refurbished model he used for freelance work, but he hadn't thought to bring it. He sat with his folder on his knees and told himself that being prepared and appearing prepared were 2 different things, and that one of them actually mattered. He'd been doing freelance electronics repair for 3 years. After his wife, Claire, passed away from a rare autoimmune condition when Emma was just 4 years old, David had done what he had to do, sold the house in the suburbs that they'd stretched to afford, moved into a smaller apartment closer to Emma's school, and built a patchwork life out of whatever work he could find. Contract repair jobs, diagnostic consulting for small businesses, late-night troubleshooting calls from clients who didn't understand that their home routers were simply unplugged. He had a master's degree in electrical engineering. He had skills that, in a different life and a different set of circumstances, might have placed him somewhere very different from where he was sitting. But life had not unfolded the way plans suggest it should, and David had long since made his peace with that. What mattered was Emma. What mattered was that she had lunch in her bag and clean clothes in her closet, and a father who showed up. He'd received the interview invitation 11 days ago. An email from Aurora Dynamics' talent acquisition team, addressed to him specifically, referencing a technical skills portfolio he'd uploaded to an engineering job board months earlier without expecting much. He'd read the email 4 times before he responded. Certain there was some error. There was no error. The position was for a senior systems diagnostics engineer, a role that paid more than he'd earned in the previous 2 years combined. When he told Emma, she'd clapped her hands and said, "We should celebrate," and they'd shared a slice of grocery store birthday cake that happened to be on clearance because it said, "Happy Birthday, Marcus," in green frosting. It had been one of the best nights he could remember in a long time. Emma was 8 years old and she was, without question, the sharpest and most wonderful person David had ever known. She had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of going very quiet when she was thinking hard about something. She asked questions that caught him off guard, real questions, the kind that required actual answers rather than the comfortable deflections adults usually offered children. One morning, about 2 weeks before the interview, she'd looked up from her cereal and said, "Dad, do you ever get tired?" He'd paused, because the honest answer was complicated. He was tired in the way that a person is tired after years of swimming upstream, not broken, not ready to stop, but aware of the current. He looked at her, at the way the morning light fell across her face, and he smiled and said, "Not when you're around." She'd considered this for a moment and then nodded, as if she'd filed it away somewhere important. He hoped it was true enough. He believed it was. The elevator opened. A woman in a gray blazer stepped out and called his name. David stood, straightened his folder, and followed her down a hallway that seemed to have been designed to communicate, with architectural precision, the distance between where someone like him was starting from and where the people at the end of it had already arrived. The walls were lined with framed patents in clean black frames, product photographs backlit with soft gallery lighting, and a timeline installation showing Aurora Dynamics' growth From a 5-person startup in a leased warehouse space to the 42-story headquarters David was currently walking through. He read the timeline as he walked. Not because he was nervous and needed somewhere to put his eyes, but because he was genuinely interested. The company's technical trajectory was impressive by any measure. Whatever else this day turned out to be, he respected the work. The woman in the gray blazer stopped at a set of frosted glass doors, opened them without ceremony, stepped aside, and he walked in. The room was a conference room with a long table and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city below in a way that seemed deliberately calibrated to remind visitors of their own smallness by comparison. The table was made of some pale, expensive wood and held 3 water glasses, 3 notepads, and 3 human beings who had the composed, assessing expressions of people who had done this many times and expected, statistically, to be disappointed. One was a man in his 40s who had a directness in his posture that suggested he made decisions quickly and didn't second-guess them. The second was a woman about his age, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and a technical document open in front of her that she'd clearly been reviewing before David walked in. The third was seated at the center. David looked at the chair they'd indicated for him, at the nameplate in front of the center seat that read Chief Executive Officer, and then at the face behind it, and the folder in his hand nearly slipped to the floor. He knew her face before his brain had time to form a complete thought about it. He knew the particular way she held herself. The slight tilt of her chin that meant she was paying very close attention. The way her dark hair fell exactly to her jaw. He had not seen her in over 10 years. But the recognition was not the slow, searching kind. It was immediate and total, like a door he hadn't known was still there, suddenly swinging open. Sophia Bennett. Sophia Bennett, who had sat beside him in advanced circuit theory during their second year at Northeastern. Sophia Bennett, who had shown up to the lab at 7 in the morning because she was the first in her family to attend university, and she was not going to waste a single hour of it. Sophia Bennett, who had cried exactly once in front of him at the end of junior year, when her scholarship had briefly been under review and had never spoken of it again. She looked at him across the table, and her expression did not change by a single degree. Her eyes were calm, professional, entirely unreadable, the eyes of someone who had learned to wear composure the way others wear armor, not to hide weakness, but to project a kind of authority that required the absence of anything that could be read as personal. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer with a white shirt beneath it, her hair shorter than he remembered, her posture. The posture of a person who had sat in rooms like this one many hundreds of times, and had never once been the least powerful person at the table. She gave him nothing, not a flicker of recognition, not the slight awkward adjustment that might accompany an unexpected encounter with someone from a shared past. She was, as far as her expression conveyed, meeting him for the first time. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice level and unhurried. "Please. Have a seat." David sat down. His heart was doing something complicated. He placed his folder on the table, with the careful precision of a man who needed something to do with his hands, and he looked at the woman across from him and tried to organize what he was feeling into something manageable. He had expected today to be difficult. He had expected the nerves of a man who had spent 3 years working independently, suddenly being assessed by a room full of senior professionals. He had not expected this. He thought, "She doesn't recognize me." The thought arrived with a certain flat sadness, the kind that comes from discovering that something you'd quietly remembered has not been similarly held by the other person. And then, almost immediately, a second thought replaced it with something more complicated. Or she does, and this is how she's chosen to handle it. He couldn't tell which was true by looking at her. She was too composed, too controlled, too much the version of herself that she'd apparently built since the version he'd known. He wasn't sure, in that moment, which possibility he would prefer: the neutrality of being a stranger, or the specific awkwardness of being seen and chosen not to be acknowledged. What David did not know, and what the omniscient weight of the story knows, is that Sophia Bennett recognized him in the precise instant he walked through the door. She had recognized the shape of his shoulders before she'd seen his face, the particular way he carried himself, unhurried, unpretentious, with the quiet steadiness of someone who had never needed to perform confidence because he had simply always possessed it. Her breath had stopped for exactly half a second. Then she had straightened in her chair, folded her hands on the table, and arranged her face into the expression she wore when she needed to be the CEO and only the CEO. She had not expected this. She had reviewed the candidate list the previous afternoon and seen a D. Carter listed and had thought nothing of it. Carter was not an uncommon name, and she had lived long enough in the world of professional distance to stop assigning emotional weight to coincidences. But then the door had opened, and it had been him, and the decade between them had collapsed into nothing. He looked older. Of course he did, they both did, but he looked tired in a way that went beyond age, a particular kind of tiredness that she recognized because she had once carried something like it herself, back when she was 19 and working 2 jobs and trying not to let anyone in the engineering department see how close to the edge she was standing. Sophia had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Worcester, Massachusetts, with her mother and a rotating cast of financial anxieties that her mother never complained about but that shaped every corner of their lives. She had earned her place at Northeastern on a merit scholarship that covered tuition and nothing else, which meant she'd worked the dinner shift at a campus dining hall 3 nights a week and tutored high school students on weekends, and still sometimes found herself calculating whether she could afford to replace her broken graphing calculator or just borrow the department's loaner. She had been proud, and she had been exhausted, and she had been, for most of her freshman year, completely alone. David had sat down next to her in that second-year circuits class, not because the seat was convenient, but because she'd left her textbook at home, and he'd seen her trying to copy the board notes fast enough to substituci, and he'd quietly slid his book across the desk without making anything of it. That was the first time. It was not the last. Over 4 years, he had given her study guides and talked her through derivations she couldn't crack alone, and told her, with a matter-of-fact certainty that somehow carried more weight than any cheerleading speech could have, that she was one of the most analytically precise thinkers he'd ever encountered, and that she was going to be fine. He had said it the way a person states a known fact. She had needed that more than he could have understood. She had also, quietly and thoroughly, and with the emotional discipline of someone who had learned not to want things she couldn't afford, fallen in love with him. She had never said so. She had been 22 and certain that people like David easy in his own skin. The kind of generous that came without a ledger ended up with people who matched that ease, not with someone still learning how to take up space in a room. She had graduated, taken a fellowship in Silicon Valley, and spent the next decade building something extraordinary out of will and intelligence and the specific hunger of someone who has something to prove. She had never stopped thinking about him, exactly, but she had learned not to linger there, and now he was sitting across from her in a suit that needed pressing in a folder with star stickers on the edge, interviewing for a mid-level technical position at the company. She had spent 8 years building into one of the most respected AI hardware firms in the country. She kept her face still. She kept her voice level. She asked the first question. Inside, something she had placed in careful storage was beginning, against her explicit wishes, to stir. The technical assessment was not something David had been warned about in detail. He'd been told there would be a practical component to the interview, but the sheet they slid across the table was more comprehensive than he'd anticipated, a systems diagnostic scenario involving Aurora's proprietary chip architecture, referencing specifications he hadn't seen before and would have to parse on the fly. The 2 other interviewers, a director of engineering named Marcus Webb and a senior technical lead named Patricia Olson, settled back in their chairs with the particular posture of people who had watched many candidates fail this portion of the process. Marcus had already made a note on his pad after looking at David's resume. It was not a generous note. David read through the materials carefully. He did not rush. He had a quality that few people in high-pressure environments manage to preserve the ability to give a problem the time it actually requires, rather than the time the room suggests it should require. He asked one clarifying question about the sensor array configuration, a precise and specific question that caused Patricia Olson to look at him briefly with something that might have been interest, and Sophia answered it in 3 words, and then he worked in silence. He made notes in the margin of the schematic in small, neat handwriting. He drew a quick diagram in the upper corner of his notepad, a simplified representation of the system interaction he was trying to visualize, then crossed it out and redrew it with different parameters. He did not perform concentration. He simply was concentrated in the way that people are when they are doing something they genuinely know how to do and find, underneath the pressure of the situation, a quiet satisfaction in doing it well. He was 12 minutes into the assessment when he stopped writing and read back through a specific section of the architecture schematic. He read it again. He set down his pen and said, quietly, "I want to flag something that may be outside the scope of this exercise." Marcus Webb looked up. Patricia Olson's pen stopped moving. Sophia watched him. David said, "There's a calibration inconsistency in the thermal sensor feedback loop right here, in the junction between the secondary processing cluster and the memory bandwidth allocation. The drift coefficient is within tolerance under standard operating conditions, but under sustained high-load operations, specifically the kind of load your Q4 deployment timeline would generate, it would produce compounding data errors in the sensor array. Over time, and we're talking a production window of roughly 6 to 8 months at scale, that discrepancy becomes significant enough to trigger system failures that would look, from the outside, like software faults." He paused. "I could be wrong, but I'd want someone to check it before I signed off on anything." The silence that followed was the particular kind that precedes a shift in the room's gravity. It was not the silence of a room that has heard something absurd. It was the silence of a room that has heard something it cannot immediately dismiss, and that does not know what to do with that fact. Marcus Webb set down his pen and looked at David with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "That section of the architecture was certified by our internal QA team 3 months ago," he said. His tone carried the specific weight of a man who had hired that QA team and approved that certification, and would prefer that both decisions remain unimpeachable. David nodded. And his nod had nothing performative in it. No apology, no deference, no attempt to soften what he was about to say by surrounding it with qualifications. "I understand. I'm not questioning the quality of that certification. I'm certain it was thorough given the data available at that time. What I'm saying is different. The interaction between these two specific systems under the projected load conditions of your Q4 deployment creates an emergent problem that would not have been visible during the standard certification window." He turned the schematic around on the table and showed them exactly where he was pointing. Placing his finger on the junction he'd identified and walking through the logic one step at a time, in plain language, unhurried and precise, the way a person explains something they are absolutely certain of to people they are not trying to impress, only to inform, the room went quiet again. This silence was different from the first one, denser, more deliberate. Patricia Olson had stopped writing entirely and was looking at the schematic with an expression of focused, technical attention. Marcus Webb was looking at David with an expression that had completed its journey from skepticism to something considerably less comfortable. Sophia looked at the schematic. Then she looked at David, and for just a fraction of a second less than that, a fragment of a moment too small to be named something crossed her face that was not the CEO, and not the composed professional, and not the person conducting an interview. Then it was gone. She reached across the table and picked up her phone and typed a message to the systems architecture team 2 floors below, asking them to run a verification pass on the thermal feedback loop in the secondary processing cluster against projected Q4 load parameters, and to report back as soon as possible. The engineering team that received that message, 3 of Aurora's senior systems architects working 2 floors below, came back with a response 40 minutes later. David was sitting in the lobby with a cup of coffee the receptionist had brought him, reading an article on his phone, looking entirely unbothered by the wait. The response confirmed his analysis. Not approximately, not in the general vicinity, exactly. The thermal drift coefficient, under sustained high-load operation, would begin producing compounding errors at precisely the stage of the production cycle he had identified. The projected financial exposure, when Marcus Webb's team ran the numbers against the upcoming contract deliverables, landed somewhere between $130 and $160 million. The reputational exposure was harder to quantify and considerably worse. Sophia walked out to the lobby herself. She did not send the assistant, did not call him back upstairs, did not handle it through the standard channel that all hiring decisions at Aurora traveled through. She walked out and stood in front of David's chair until he looked up from his phone and registered who was standing there. He stood up. He still had the coffee cup in his hand, which struck her as something that in the middle of waiting to find out if his professional life was about to change, he had simply sat and read his phone and drunk his coffee, as if waiting were a thing you did without amplifying it into suffering. She said, "Mr. Carter, the team has reviewed your findings. Your analysis was correct." He nodded, just once, with the expression of a person who had already known this, and had been simply waiting for the room to catch up. She said, "The financial exposure your finding prevented would have been substantial. The project lead is already developing a correction plan." She paused. "I'd like to formally offer you the position, the full senior role, not the mid-level posting you applied for. We can discuss compensation upstairs." He looked at her for a moment, and for just an instant, she thought she could see something behind his eyes that was not just a candidate receiving good news, but something older and more complicated than that. He said, "Thank you. I'd like to accept." He started on a Monday. The first week, he said little and observed everything. He learned the floor plans of the building, the rhythm of the teams, the unofficial hierarchies that existed in the spaces between the organizational chart. He helped 2 junior engineers debug a firmware issue on a Thursday afternoon because he happened to overhear them struggling in the corridor, and the solution was clear to him within 4 minutes. He didn't make a production of it. He simply helped, the way he always had, and then went back to his desk. Marcus Webb watched him with the specific attention of a man recalibrating a prior judgment. Patricia Olson sent him a technical paper she'd written 3 years ago on thermal management in high-density processors, with a note that said she thought he might find it interesting. He wrote back that he had already read it, in 2021, and that her approach to layered heat dissipation in Section 4 had influenced some of his own diagnostic methodology. She forwarded that message to Sophia without comment. Sophia observed him from a careful distance. It was the only kind of distance she trusted herself to maintain, and she was honest enough with herself to know why that was. She watched him move through the office with the same unhurried competence she remembered from the engineering labs at Northeastern, the same quality of attention he'd always brought to things, not performative focus, not the kind of concentration that announces itself, but the real kind, the quiet kind, that simply gets things done and moves on without requiring acknowledgement. She noticed the way junior members of his team came to him with questions and left with answers and, more importantly, left with a slightly better understanding of how to find the answers themselves, because David had always taught by asking rather than telling, by posing the next question rather than providing the final solution. She noticed the way he stayed late twice in the first week, not because he was trying to make an impression, but because he'd found something that interested him and wanted to work it through. She told herself she was evaluating a new employee. She was not entirely wrong. She was also not entirely right. And the part of her that was not entirely right was the part she'd spent 12 years being careful not to listen to. About 3 weeks after David started, Emma came to the office. It was a half day at school, some kind of teacher training, and David had arranged for her to be dropped off at Aurora's lobby by a neighbor who happened to pass the building on her way home. Emma arrived at 4:15 in a yellow rain jacket with a backpack that was almost as big as she was, and she marched up to the front desk and announced that she was looking for her dad with the calm authority of a person who has never doubted their right to be anywhere they decide to go. The receptionist called upstairs. David came down and Emma launched herself at him from 6 feet away, with the total abandon of a child who knows she will always be caught. He caught her, of course, and held her up and said something into her hair that made her laugh. Sophia had been heading to the parking structure when she passed through the lobby and stopped. She was not entirely sure why she stopped. She told herself she was reviewing something on her phone. She watched David set Emma down, watched Emma take his hand, and begin immediately explaining something, an entire narrative, complete with hand gestures about something that had happened at school that day. He listened with his whole body, the way he always had, Emma spotted Sophia before Sophia had processed the impulse to move away. Children are ruthless in their perceptiveness. Emma looked at her with frank, interested eyes and said, "Hi. Do you work with my dad?" Sophia said that she did. Emma nodded, satisfied. "He's the best at fixing things," Emma said, with the certainty of established fact. "He fixed our refrigerator and our neighbor's car, and once he fixed a helicopter." Sophia looked at David. He said quietly, "It was a remote-controlled helicopter." Emma shrugged, as if the distinction was not particularly relevant to her argument. "He's really good," she said. "He's probably the smartest person I know." Sophia thought, "Me too, actually." She said, "It was very nice to meet you, Emma," and walked to her car, and sat in it for a moment longer than she needed to before she started the engine. She called her best friend, a woman named Rachel, who had known her since graduate school and was constitutionally incapable of telling her what she wanted to hear, and said without preamble, "This is a problem." Rachel said, "What is?" Sophia said, "He works for me." Rachel said, "Oh." There was a pause. Then Rachel said, "Is it a problem because of the professional complications, or is it a problem because you know exactly what you want and that terrifies you?" Sophia said, "Good night, Rachel." She drove home. She sat with a cup of tea at her kitchen counter and looked at nothing for a while and thought about what honesty would cost her and whether she could afford it. She invited him to dinner 6 weeks after he started. She framed it as a professional check-in, a chance to discuss the technical roadmap for the following quarter, and she chose a restaurant that was exactly calibrated between clearly personal and clearly professional, nice enough to suggest intention, public enough to suggest neutrality. David arrived 4 minutes early. He ordered water and looked at the menu and looked at her and said, "This isn't really about the technical roadmap, is it?" She had not expected him to say that. She said, "No, not entirely." He nodded. "Okay," he said. Good. They talked about the university for a long time. About the specific winter of their junior year when the HVAC in the engineering building had failed for 2 weeks and they'd all worked in their coats. About Professor Alderman, who had been famous for his terrifying oral examinations and his legendary generosity toward any student who showed genuine effort. About the year Sophia had nearly withdrawn from the program, and David had sat with her in the library on a Sunday afternoon and laid out, with characteristic clarity, all the specific and concrete reasons that her fear was not the same as the truth. She said, that night at dinner, "You changed the direction of my life, you know, when you said that." "I'm not being dramatic," he said. "I was just saying what I could see," she said. "Most people can't see." He looked at her in a way that made the restaurant noise recede slightly. "I know," he said. She said, "Did you ever back then, did you think about what might have happened if things had gone differently?" He was quiet for a moment. The question had the quality of something carefully held. "Yes," he said. "More than you might think." She looked at her water glass. "I was afraid," she said. "I was always afraid back then that wanting something was the same as inviting it to be taken away." He said, "I know. I saw that too." She looked up. "And you never said anything." He said, "You had enough to carry." The honesty of that, the plain, uncomplicated generosity of it hit her somewhere specific and clean. They drove back separately, and she stood in her kitchen again with her tea, and thought about the fact that she had spent a decade building something she was proud of, had made decisions that were hard and correct, had learned to read rooms and people and situations with a precision that had made her exceptional at what she did, and that none of that intelligence, not a single application of it, had been directed toward the question of what she actually wanted. She was 35 years old. She had a company that was growing, a reputation she'd earned entirely on her own terms, and a very well-appointed apartment that she sometimes came home to and moved through without feeling particularly present in. She had friends, good ones, and a life that was full by any reasonable external accounting. But she also had, sitting in a quiet and persistent corner of her interior life, an honest recognition that the thing she'd left unclaimed at 22 was still there, unchanged, patient, waiting in the specific way that true things wait, without pressure, without ultimatum, just existing and being true. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday, the way crises usually do, without ceremony and at an inconvenient time. Aurora Dynamics had been in the final stages of a landmark partnership agreement with a European semiconductor consortium, a deal that would have positioned the company as the primary AI chip supplier for an expanding network of research institutions across 6 countries. The contract was worth approximately $240 million over 4 years, and it was, by any measure, the most significant business development in Aurora's history. On that Tuesday morning, a series of internal technical documents, proprietary testing data, confidential production timelines, preliminary pricing structures appeared in the hands of a trade publication that had no business having them. The publication reached out for comment at 8 in the morning. By 9, the story was live. By 10, 3 of the consortium's representatives had contacted Sophia's office to express concern. The boardroom by 11 o'clock was not a comfortable place. Board members dialed in from 3 time zones. The head of investor relations was managing 4 calls simultaneously. The legal team was in a room down the hall performing the forensic equivalent of emergency surgery. Sophia stood at the head of the table and managed the room with the composure that had taken her years to develop. The kind that doesn't suppress panic so much as redirect it into useful action, but she could feel the structure of the situation pressing in. Someone inside the company had done this. Someone with access to systems that very few people could reach. She didn't yet know who. What she knew was that the window for containing the damage was narrow, and the clock was running. David had been pulled into the response team by Patricia Olson at 8:30, before the full scope of the breach was understood. His access to the relevant systems was newer than most of the investigation teams, which meant he had a perspective the others lacked. He could see the shape of the architecture without the accumulated assumptions that long familiarity tends to build. He spent 4 hours going through access logs, cross-referencing timestamps against the document metadata embedded in the leaked files, tracing the path backward with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. He did not announce his progress. He simply worked. At 2:15 in the afternoon, he walked to Sophia's office and knocked on the open door. She was on the phone and held up one finger. He waited in the doorway. When she hung up, she said, "Tell me." He set his laptop on her desk and showed her what he'd found. A sequence of access events that didn't follow normal operational patterns, timed in intervals, that corresponded to a specific user's documented work hours over the previous 3 weeks. The user was Richard Harmon, who held the title of Executive Director of Strategic Partnerships and had been with Aurora for 5 years. He had authorized access to every document that had been leaked. His access timestamps showed consistent nighttime activity in the weeks leading up to the breach activity that his own stated work schedule did not explain. Sophia looked at the screen for a long moment. The data was unambiguous once you knew where to look. And David had laid out each element with the same clarity he brought to everything. No flourish, no inflation of the drama, just the evidence and the logic that connected it. Richard Harmon had been in the boardroom that morning, seated 3 chairs to Sophia's left. His expression, one of practiced concern, his contributions to the crisis discussion precisely calibrated to the frequency of a loyal lieutenant. She had not suspected him. She thought, briefly, of the things she did not know about the people she trusted, and the thought moved through her like a cold current. She looked up from the screen. She said, very quietly, "Are you certain?" David said, "I'm certain enough to bring it to legal and let them make the call. I wouldn't have come to you if I wasn't." She understood exactly what that meant. He had the same standard she did. You don't tell someone something you're not sure of, and you don't stay silent about something you are. She nodded once and reached for her phone. The emergency board meeting convened at 4 o'clock. The evidence was presented formally, with legal counsel walking through each element in sequence, the access logs and timestamp correlations, and the documentary trail that David had assembled over 4 hours, displayed on the conference room screen, with the dispassionate clarity of facts that do not need amplification. Board members asked questions. Legal counsel answered them. The process had the quality of something inevitably arriving at its conclusion. Richard Harmon was contacted by the legal team and asked to provide an explanation for the documented access pattern. He provided several explanations, each less satisfactory than the last, and then he stopped providing explanations. The consortium representatives in Europe were contacted through Sophia's office with a full briefing on the situation, the identification of the source, and the steps being taken to ensure the integrity of all future confidential materials. They spent 2 hours in discussion among themselves before sending word that they wished to proceed with the partnership on the original terms. Aurora's communications team issued a public statement by 6 o'clock that evening. The trade publication issued a clarifying statement the following morning. By the time most of Aurora's employees arrived at the building the next day, the crisis had been resolved, not minimized, not managed into ambiguity, but actually resolved, and the company was intact. The lobby of Aurora Dynamics at 6:30 that evening was nearly empty. Most of the crisis response team had gone home, exhausted and relieved in the particular way that follows a day of sustained emergency. David was gathering his bag in the engineering department when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Sophia was standing in the doorway. She had taken off her suit jacket and was holding it folded over one arm. And she looked, for the first time since he'd walked into that interview room, like herself. Not the CEO, just herself. He remembered that version of her. He'd always liked it best. She walked into the room and stopped a few feet away from him and said, "Thank you." It was not a corporate thank you. It landed differently. He said, "It's what I'm here for." She said, "No. I mean, yes, of course, but that's not what I mean." She looked at him for a moment, with the expression of someone stepping off a ledge they've been standing at the edge of for a long time. 12 years ago, she said, you sat in a library with me on a Sunday afternoon, when I was about to give up on something that mattered to me more than anything. And you told me the truth. You told me I was capable, not because it was kind, but because it was accurate, and you couldn't see the point in withholding it. He waited. "I built this company," she said. "I built it because I believed I could, and the first time I really believed that the first time I genuinely held that as a possibility rather than a hope was because of you." Her voice had steadied at some point during this speech, the way voices do when the speaker decides they are going to finish regardless of the cost. "And then today," she said, "you did it again. You sat down in the middle of a crisis, and you followed the truth to where it led. And you handed me something that saved everything I've spent my adult life building." She stopped. "I don't know how to hold that lightly," she said. "I'm not sure I want to." David set his bag down. He looked at her, at the woman who had always, underneath every achievement and every composed professional surface, been the most honest person he'd known. He said, "I wasn't trying to be a hero." Either time, she said, "I know. That's the whole problem." He smiled. It was a slow, genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes before it reached his mouth. He said, "Sophia." She said, "Yes." He said, "I thought about you in the years since. More than once." She said, "I know you did. You told me at dinner." He said, "I'm telling you again." She looked at him for a moment, with her whole face open, no composure, nothing managed, just the thing she'd been carrying for years with no place to put it down. Then she stepped forward, and he reached out and took her hand, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there wasn't anything left that needed saying. The months that followed had the quality of something slowly and carefully unfolding. Not fast, neither of them was young enough for fast, or careless enough, or without the particular gravity that comes from having lost things that mattered. They moved with intention, which is the only way that people who have learned the cost of recklessness know how to move. David was promoted to Director of Systems Engineering, a title that surprised no one on the technical team, and exactly 3 members of the senior leadership who'd needed an additional 4 months to stop being surprised by him. He took the new role with the same equanimity he'd taken the junior position, without fanfare, simply showing up and doing the work, and trusting that the work would speak, because it always had. Emma thrived. Third grade gave way to fourth, and Emma gave way to the version of herself that was becoming someone of genuine and specific interest. A child with strong opinions about ocean ecology, an obsession with competitive puzzle solving, and a developing habit of reading at the dinner table that David didn't have the heart to discourage, even when he probably should have. She had absorbed the news of Sophia's presence in their lives, with the equanimity of a child who had always trusted her father's judgment, asking only a handful of practical questions. Will she be at breakfast sometimes? And, does she know how to play chess? Before apparently filing the situation under acceptable and moving on. She and Sophia had developed their own rapport, independent of David, the particular kind that forms between an adult who takes a child seriously and a child who notices when that is happening. Sophia took Emma to the Natural History Museum on a Saturday in March, because Emma had expressed interest in a new deep-sea exhibit, and David had a systems review that ran long. They came back 3 hours later with a bag of fossils from the gift shop, and a shared and detailed theory about bioluminescent adaptation that they explained to David in overlapping sentences over dinner. He sat across the table from them, listening to his daughter and this woman he had known for so long in so many forms, and felt something settle quietly in his chest. Not completion exactly, because he had never experienced his life without Claire as incomplete, but something else. A sense that the shape of things had found a version that fit. On a Friday evening in late September, Aurora Dynamics held its annual company celebration, a tradition Sophia had instituted in the second year of the company's operation as a way of acknowledging, publicly and specifically, the people whose work had built what existed. The event was held in the building's top-floor atrium, a room that looked out over the city in every direction, and it was attended by several hundred employees and their guests, and a number of the company's long-term partners. Emma was there in a blue dress that she'd chosen herself, sitting with Patricia Olson's teenage daughter, and looking, from across the room, very much like a person who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Sophia took the stage at 8 o'clock. She spoke about the year, the difficulties, and the unexpected gifts, the ways that a company is not a collection of products or contracts but of decisions, and that the quality of those decisions comes from the people willing to make them honestly. She spoke about the partnership that had nearly collapsed and been recovered, and she spoke about what the recovery had revealed, not just about the robustness of Aurora's systems, but about the particular kind of person she wanted beside her when things went wrong. She paused. The room was quiet in the attentive way that rooms become when a speaker is about to say something they have not said in a script. The most important person in my professional life, she said, is not a board member or an investor or a mentor with a famous name. It is someone who sat beside me in an engineering classroom when I was 20 years old and afraid of my own potential, and who looked at me with complete seriousness and said, "You are going to be fine." Not as reassurance, as a statement of fact. She stepped away from the podium. The room watched. She walked down the steps from the stage and across the atrium floor to where David was standing near the edge of the room with his hands in his pockets, and she stopped in front of him. Several hundred people were watching. Neither of them appeared to notice. "I have been afraid," she said, "of getting this wrong, of wanting something and having it be taken away. But I've spent 12 years being careful about this specific thing. And I'm done." She looked at him with the absolute steadiness of someone who has finally stopped negotiating with themselves. "I don't want to let you go again. I don't think I can do it a second time. And I don't want to." He looked at her, at this woman who had built something extraordinary out of will and intellect and quiet, dogged refusal to give up, who had sat across from him in that interview room and maintained perfect composure when everything in her had apparently been doing something quite different, who had shown his daughter bioluminescent fish on a Saturday in March, and argued cheerfully about evolutionary theory over dinner, and he said, "Sophia, you have never been going to lose me." And then he stepped forward and put his arms around her, and she held on. Emma appeared at their side approximately 45 seconds later, having navigated the crowd with the efficiency of a child on a mission. She looked up at both of them with frank satisfaction. "Finally," she said. They both laughed. David pulled her in. The three of them stood like that in the middle of the atrium, with the city spread out in every direction through the glass walls, lit up and alive, and the sound of the room moving around them in the warm, celebratory way that rooms full of people move when something good is happening somewhere among them. They left the building together a little before 10. The night air was cool and clear, and the street was quiet, except for the sound of the city in its evening register. Emma walked between them and held both their hands, swinging slightly with each step in the way she had always done since she was small, and the three of them crossed the plaza in front of Aurora Dynamics and walked toward the parking structure and the drive home. David thought, walking, about the morning 11 months ago when he'd stood on this same sidewalk, with a pressed blazer and a folder covered in star stickers, and the modest, specific hope of finding something stable, something that would hold. He had not imagined this. He had not let himself imagine this, because imagining it had felt like the kind of wanting that invites loss. But here it was regardless, not imagined but real, not hoped for but arrived. A daughter who had never stopped believing in him. A woman who had never stopped carrying something she couldn't name. A city full of evening light, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of people finding their way to each other, across the long distances that years and circumstance and fear can build. He had come here looking for a job. What he had found was the beginning of the rest of his life. And it had been here all along, waiting with the quiet patience of things that were always meant to happen.